Are you aware there's currently a global energy crisis? Of course you are. It's almost anything anybody can talk about, especially if you live somewhere like Europe, where the power firms are currently going through margin calls needing about 1.5 trillion euros. Or if you live somewhere like California, where the Governor Newsom just recently told Californians to turn up their thermostats to 78 degrees and not use major appliances during the middle of the day, because otherwise they risk massive blackouts. Or if you live in Germany, where they're currently keeping nuclear power plants online and starting to burn coal because of the depth of their energy crisis. This is because over the last few decades, fossil fuels have slowly but surely become insufficient for our energy needs, while renewable sources of energy like wind and solar are completely unreliable. And finally, energy sources like nuclear have been so underdeveloped that they are nowhere near large enough to support our current energy needs. So why has this happened over the last few decades? Well, it's not because of deglobalization, and it's not because of globalization, and it's not because of climate change, and it's not because of war. The real cause, the root cause, fiat currency. That's right, when you trace these things back to the root, fiat currency is the source of the current global energy crisis, and I'm going to prove to you how. Ready? Let's dive in. Here's the thesis that we are going to work through the rest of this video to determine whether it is true or not. Number one, fiat currency allows the money supply to be expanded infinitely. Number two, governments use this infinite expansion of the money supply to fund any and all of their expenses. The only limit then would be political will. Number three, because of this capacity to spend with no limit, there is no feedback mechanism to instruct the government to stop spending. This means there is no anchor or no cutoff for the government to fund, support, and subsidize destructive policies, laws, and regulations. As this pertains to energy, the world has seen decades of destructive policies imposed on it, funded, supported, and subsidized by fiat currency, and that has built today's energy crisis. So that is the thesis. Now, if it is correct, we would expect some evidence to start showing up as soon as the world transitioned into the fiat era, because we know for the last 3,000 years, the world has been on some sort of a gold standard. People traded gold coin as money, eventually started putting it in banks and trading paper that was redeemable for that gold. Eventually, those banks became nationalized with the invention of the central bank a few hundred years ago, and eventually the central banking system was globalized in 1944 at Bretton Woods, when the Federal Reserve became the central bank to all central banks, and the rest of the world pegged their currencies to the dollar, which was pegged to gold. So for all of human history up until the end of this gold standard, governments spending was limited by the amount of gold they could get from their citizens. Now, we all know this gold standard system failed epically in 1971 after the United States government had printed too many dollars and the rest of the world started to run on the bank, the United States Federal Reserve, and tried to get the gold, and there wasn't enough gold. And from that point on, the rest of the world was unanchored from gold, including the United States. This meant governments were no longer limited to printing money based on how much gold they had. They had an unlimited amount of money they could spend simply by printing more of it. All it requires is political will. This means that 1971 should be the demarcation point. It should be the point at which we can see some evidence start to show up that an unlimited amount of government spending by fiat currency printing would have an impact on energy. So let's take a look at some charts. Number one here, let's take a look at the cost of a barrel of oil. We can see that it was very stable for many decades with some volatility in certain times, but for the most part, it was flat. And this arrow indicates where 1971 is, and within just a few short years, we start to see the price of oil absolutely skyrocket skyrocket. Now, we also saw the price of oil go down here, and then it dropped to negative terms in 2020. This chart is just a little bit dated because the price of oil is now back up here. But in any case, we've seen a long-term trend of the cost of a barrel of oil increasing over time, and that started after the world was depegged from gold. Next, we're looking at energy and real GDP per capita for G7 countries. So the blue line shows the real GDP per person, so the amount of economic growth, the amount of wealth there is per person. The red line shows the energy use per person, and the red arrow shows 1971 here. There's a very clear point here in which energy use per person started to move sideways. So number one, we have the cost of oil starting to increase starting in the 70s, and we have the consumption of energy starting to move sideways since the 70s. Next, let's look at this, which I think is one of the most important charts here. This is the energy use per capita. So we can see energy consumption is the blue line here. And then the red line is the Henry Adams curve, which projects where it should have gone. But instead, right here in 1971, we start to see energy usage per person move sideways and flatline. This is important because since the early 1800s, there has been on average a 2% increase in energy consumption per year, all throughout this entire time, and that changed as soon as governments were able to spend as much money as they wanted with no limit like a gold standard. The ability for government spending to be unlimited based purely on political will meant that suddenly people stopped consuming more energy. This is contrary to the trend that had existed for almost 2 centuries. And finally, when we break it down by energy type, we can see that energy on average was increasing in its consumption, again, per person, and nuclear was just starting to get going, but something happened and it flatlined. Because biofuels were the main source of energy that people used, and then as soon as coal came into the mix, people started using a lot more coal. And then as soon as oil came into the mix, people started using a lot more oil, and so on and so forth as people discover more energy dense forms of energy that are better and cheaper. People use more and more of them, but that did not happen with nuclear. This shows that since the 70s, we've seen a severe change in energy habits around the globe. We've seen a lack in energy improvements. We've seen a lack of innovation. We've seen a departure from the growth of abundance of energy. We've seen a departure in the growth of cost-effective energy and an increase in the absolute cost of energy as energy has become relatively more scarce, departing from the long-term trend of becoming more abundant. So now we can clearly see that at the very least there's a correlation that as soon as governments were unrestricted in how much money they could spend, we saw a severe departure in the way that energy usage had been going for almost 2 centuries. But correlation does not equal causation, so what is the cause and how might that mechanism actually work? This is where we have to break down the relationship between laws and profits. So we're going to go step by step through this. Number one, behavior, human action maximizes profits. Example, when I buy a car, I profit. This is subjective. Profit is subjective, not objective. Because me buying that car is me stating that that car is more valuable to me than my money in my bank account. I'd rather have that car than my money. Why is that? Well, it's because it allows me to drive to work. And without that car, I wouldn't be able to drive to work. Keep in mind, this is subjective, not objective. It's not that the car is objectively more valuable than the money. Otherwise, I would buy a second car and a third car and a fourth car, as many as I could, but it's not. It's the use of the first car that's more profitable to me. So me buying that first car is a profit to the car company because they want my money more than that car. It's also profitable to me because I want that car more than I want my money. We both net a profit. Otherwise, neither of us would engage in that exchange if the profit was only one-sided. And every action that humans take, all human behaviors, are filtered through this process. What are the actions that I can take that will make me most better off? This means that left purely alone, if we are able to make all of our decisions completely freely, all of our decisions will be ranked through that filter, and we will take human actions and go through life making decisions that are most profitable to our own needs. And just as we saw before, that doesn't mean it's a net loss to somebody else, because exchange only happens when both parties profit, not when only one party profits. So that is statement one, that human action increases profits for both parties because profit is subjective. Number two, laws change behaviors. That is the point of a law. There would be no purpose to have a law that stated all humans must sleep at some point sometimes for some length of time, because everybody sleeps. So nobody would ever think to make a bill, pass a law or a regulation that stated humans had to sleep, because humans already sleep. So it wouldn't change any behavior, and there would be no need to do it because people already do that. So the point of laws and regulations and the results of laws and regulations is that human behavior is changed from what it would be to something else. So let's put those two together. Left alone, all human actions will maximize profits for both parties engaged in any action. Laws change behaviors to something other than what they would be freely. Therefore, laws by definition, decrease profits, destroy wealth. They do this by eliminating or changing behaviors. Real example of this, let's go back to the car. Let's say I need a car so that I can get to work, so that I can profit. I have the money to buy a cheap gas car that gets bad gas mileage. But the state that I live in, let's say, stopped selling gas cars with bad gas mileage. Now, personally, let's say I can't afford an electric car or a hybrid. This means that the law prevented me from doing something that would have made me profit and the car company profit. This means that both of us are worse off, less profitable, with less wealth because of a law or a regulation. And it's not just these types of policies, it is all policies. That is how they work. So how does this pertain to the current global energy crisis? All laws and regulations and taxes and subsidies relating to energy are net destructive because they influence and change behaviors. It's important to recognize that there is no world in which wind and solar would exist to the extent that they do today without government regulations, laws, taxes on other forms of energy, and subsidies for these forms of energy. This is because green energy is less reliable, more harmful to local environments, both wiping out local animal populations and deep mining for rare earth minerals. The waste from these products fills up in landfills, it's toxic, and it never goes away. The lifespan of these energy sources are extremely short. The energy density of these energy sources is not very dense. You need many, many acres to provide a very small amount of energy. And on top of all this, they are more expensive. The only way anybody affords them is on the backs of taxpayer funded, or I should say fiat currency inflationary financing funded subsidies and slave labor in China. Absent government intervention, nuclear today would be providing most of the world's electricity needs. It is the safest, the cleanest, the cheapest, and the most energy-dense form of energy by huge margins in every single one of those categories, not even close. The only reason it is so costly today to get a new nuclear power plant up and running is regulations. The free market cost of a new nuclear power plant is not $10 to $15 billion. That is strictly due to regulations. So governments for decades have been imposing on the world destructive and unprofitable energy policies, funded by fiat currency, unlimited government spending through inflation. All government policies used to have to be funded with taxes, which means that after a policy destroyed enough wealth, the direct feedback would be strong enough that people would just say no, because the impact of those incompetent decisions would be very clearly seen. But in the fiat era, regulations are funded with inflation. You can simply just print more money. And anytime something fails, you can just say, well, we just didn't do it big enough. We just got to print more money to pay for it bigger next time. These laws and regulations and subsidies have caused human behavior to change, and it's directed capital, resources, labor, and actions into unreliable. This has shifted and influenced and changed human behavior to underdevelop and underinvest in better forms of energy, like hydrocarbons and nuclear. And because very obviously, as the population grows, the amount of energy that humans need to consume will also grow. This has led to a pending global energy crisis, and we are now starting to see that crisis unfold today. The only solution to this is to force governments out of energy. They're only causing harm. Now, this can be done by everybody loudly advocating and pushing for freedom. It can also be done by a return to sound money, and governments would have a leash on their incompetence yet again. As always, I really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.